The spring of 1945 was unlike any other moment in modern European history. Cities lay in ruins, armies once feared were retreating, and the fate of nations rested on last decisions. Among those who witnessed this collapse was General Heinz Guderian, one of Germany's most influential military thinkers. Captured and interrogated by the Americans, he spoke with candor and caution about the final operations of the Wehrmacht. What did he reveal about those desperate months? And what lessons did his interrogators seek to draw? If stories like these intrigue you, make sure to like this video and subscribe. More captivating accounts from history await ahead. By early 1945, the Wehrmacht faced disaster. In the west, Allied forces had crossed the Rhine. In the east, the Red Army prepared its assault on Berlin. Heinz Guderian, recalled in 1944 as chief of the General Staff, struggled to bring order to chaos. Known as the architect of armored warfare, Guderian urged flexible defense and withdrawals to preserve men and equipment. Hitler, however, demanded ground be held at all costs. The clash came to a head during the Soviet Vistula Oder Offensive in January 1945, when Soviet armies advanced hundreds of kilometers in weeks. Guderian had requested reserves, but his warnings went unheeded. The collapse confirmed his view that strategic decisions were guided by ideology rather than military logic. In later interrogations, he described these failures as tragic proof of how command had lost touch with reality. Though critical, he still framed himself as a soldier bound by duty, not as one openly opposing authority. With Germany's surrender in May 1945, Guderian was taken into American custody. For the Allies, he was more than a general. He was the father of the Panzer arm, whose ideas had reshaped modern warfare. The Americans wanted not just reports, but methodical analysis. Interrogations were conducted with a mix of formality and pragmatism. Questions were clear, technical, and structured, but the officers leading them also sought to build a rapport. They were less interested in personal guilt than in extracting practical lessons. Guderian quickly recognized this and answered in detail, often illustrating his points with maps, diagrams, and anecdotes from campaigns. The Americans questioned him on two main themes: technical knowledge of armored operations and evaluations of Germany's final battles. Guderian explained how the Wehrmacht shifted from attack to defense after 1943, emphasizing mobile reserves, anti-tank tactics, and prepared positions. He stressed the futility of Hitler's rigid stand-fast orders, which drained units and denied commanders flexibility. For the Americans, this testimony confirmed battlefield impressions. German defensive skill was formidable, but by 1945, overwhelming Allied resources left little room for maneuver. What they valued most was Guderian's analysis of systemic failure, how political interference had undermined professional judgment. The Eastern Front was central to Guderian's reflections. He had seen Army Group Center destroyed in 1944 and the Soviets' drive toward Berlin. To him, defeat stemmed less from lack of courage than from strategic blindness. He described how Hitler's insistence on holding ground contradicted the principle of mobility. During the Vistula-Oder crisis, he argued for shortening the front and moving reserves eastward. Hitler rejected these plans, claiming Berlin was safe. When the Soviet assault began, German forces were stretched thin, reserves were absent, and command decisions lagged behind events. In Interrogations, Guderian admitted that delaying actions could have slowed the Soviets, but ultimate defeat was unavoidable. He lamented the waste of divisions sacrificed without purpose, yet he noted that small battle groups, though weakened, still fought with discipline and skill, delaying Soviet advances longer than expected. For the Americans, this confirmed both the tactical resilience of the Wehrmacht and the futility of resistance against overwhelming force. American officers pressed him especially about the battles on Soviet soil. They wanted to know how the Wehrmacht had coped with vast distances, brutal winters, and relentless attrition. Guderian explained that by 1944, the Eastern Front had become a war of exhaustion that Germany could not win. His words, analytical rather than emotional, impressed interrogators who were preparing to study Soviet capabilities in the emerging Cold War. While the East consumed Germany's strength, the West delivered its final blow. The Ardennes offensive of late 1944, which Guderian opposed, drained reserves without realistic prospects. When Allied armies crossed the Rhine in March 1945, the Wehrmacht had little left to resist. Guderian recalled meetings where Hitler still spoke of counterattacks, while staff officers knew the war was lost. Fuel shortages crippled mobility, divisions were fragmented, and morale collapsed. He admitted that in April 1945, commanders carried out their duties without hope, seeking only to spare soldiers when possible. Dismissed in March after disputes with Hitler, Guderian did not take part in Berlin's defense. From a distance, he condemned Hitler's order to fight to the last man, seeing it as the final symbol of irrational leadership. To him, the fall of Berlin epitomized the triumph of ideology over military reason. The Americans were fascinated not only by Guderian's criticism of Hitler, but by his detailed accounts of armored warfare. He explained principles that had once brought Germany rapid victories: concentrated forces, deep thrusts, and close coordination of tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support. By 1943, shortages of fuel, crews, and aircraft eroded these methods, forcing a shift to local counterattacks and defensive tactics. For the U.S. Army, his insights were practical. They compared them to their experiences in Normandy and anticipated how future conflicts might unfold. Guderian's reflections helped shape early Cold War doctrine on armored warfare. The Americans also explored the psychology of command under dictatorship. Guderian acknowledged frustration with political interference, but insisted he was bound by duty. He told interrogators that generals had little freedom once Hitler issued his personal orders, and disobedience would have meant immediate dismissal or worse. To the Americans, this highlighted the limits of military independence under totalitarian rule and offered sobering lessons about civil-military relations in any state. Removed from command in March 1945, Guderian spent the final weeks of the war sidelined. He lived partly with his family, hearing reports of collapsing fronts. For a general who had once believed in decisive maneuver, this helplessness was bitter. In captivity, he found himself in an unusual position. He was not treated as a criminal, but as a resource. American officers provided food, paper, and sometimes even access to literature, asking him to prepare written accounts of operations. Though stripped of power, he remained valued as a teacher of sorts. To Guderian, this was a strange irony. The same doctrines that had once fueled conquest were now being preserved by his former enemies. During these weeks, he also reflected on his past. According to some accounts, he expressed regret not for his military role, but for the way politics had overwhelmed military sense. He portrayed himself as a professional who had tried to save men and preserve discipline in a collapsing system. Whether this was self-justification or genuine conviction, it became part of the legacy he left behind. Captured in May, he presented himself as a professional soldier, willing to explain, but not to justify. This stance, together with his reputation as an innovator, shielded him from harsher treatment. For the Americans, he remained a source of military insight rather than political reckoning. His interrogations and later memoirs shaped his legacy. Posterity remembered him as the theorist of armored warfare and a critic of Hitler, though unable to alter events. For Guderian, the last defeats of the Wehrmacht symbolized the destruction of rational strategy under the weight of ideology. History often speaks in victories and defeats, yet Guderian's testimony shows endings are more complex. His account reveals an army caught between military logic and political command. For the Americans, his words provided lessons for the future. For us, they remind us of the fragile line between decision and disaster, and the enduring need to learn from the past. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss the next journey into the echoes of the past.